Alright, so we're talking about sharpening. You might have tried sharpening in the past, you might have heard about different methods and different ways of doing sharpening. Sharpening gets really complicated really quickly, but the things that we need to keep in mind are that sharpening is the process for woodworkers of creating two flat planes that intersect on a cutting edge. I hope you can see that. And that's it. These two planes we're going to continuously abrade until we get a nice usable surface here that is good for cutting. And that's it. A lot of people complicate it with various methods, and we'll talk about some of those, but that's kind of what it is. Books have been written about the process of sharpening, and that's fine. These are incredible references. But I think that for what we're doing, talking about sharpening chisels and hand plane blades, this is going to be enough to get us started. Alright, so let's talk about a couple of the methods, and specifically what we're going to need to get into the sharpening process. Some of these work better than others, but they have benefits, and some are better than others. What you can't see here, because it's oxidized, it's rusted, and it's been used for many, many years. This is a diamond sharpening stone. And these two surfaces have been impregnated with various coarsenesses of diamond stones. One's a little bit more coarse, one's a little bit finer. And the theory is you could use this and abrade both of those planes that I illustrated there on this thing, and that works. Diamonds are very, very dense, and so they will cut quickly. You can use this wet or dry, good. The problem with these is that the more metal that you run across the surface of these faces, they start to abrade or break away, they friable this surface here, where the diamonds start to break off. And then you're left with very, very slow peaks of the diamonds. They start off really tall, you're abrading, then they start to break and fragment off, and then you have really fine points that are actually doing the cutting. And it just takes forever. I've tried this and have been really happy with it at the start, and then 20 minutes, maybe 2 days into sharpening, whatever 2 days of use of this thing is, I start to notice it's not cutting as fast as it used to. So I would never sharpen with this anymore because it has some downsides to it. These things have their purpose, but not my favorite for sharpening. Okay, then other people have used something called the scary sharp method, which in essence just uses sandpaper. Sandpaper is adhered to something that needs to be flat. This is a 12 by 12 piece of granite, and you can get this in any tile store. This is a couple bucks, maybe $5, $8 for just this piece, and then you're in business. Downsides to this are that this sandpaper needs to be held into place as we're dragging our tools across this, and this has a tendency of sliding around, and there are ways of holding it down. But the thing that I found most common with the scary sharp method is that people will tape 2 of the 4 corners into place, and if you use double stick tape, that tape now goes below the surface of the sandpaper, and as you're abrading this away, it starts to create something that's less than flat. The other problem you run into is your sandpaper is very similar to the diamond stone in that it has a shelf life. It works beautifully for the first couple of passes, and then it starts to lose its abrasiveness, and then you're basically just rubbing metal on this backing, the paper. So it's not ideal for long-term sharpening, and that's kind of the downside. It's inexpensive, so for these two things I'm into a sharpening method for $10 maybe. So it works, it has its place. The other thing that I don't love about this process is that given the thickness of this granite, and a lot of people use float glass as well, half-inch float glass I think is better than anything thinner than that. But whatever you're resting this thing on, let's say there's some foreign material here on your bench or wherever you're sharpening, This could have a tendency of flexing as you're exerting downward pressure in the sharpening process. I just don't love this because if this is not consistently flat, you're never going to get a flat surface out of this. So I don't like this, coupled with the fact that you have to change out the paper fairly frequently. I'm not in love with these options. The other thing about this, and I should have mentioned this before, so I talked about tape for holding this thing down with the Scary Sharp method. The other thing that some people do is they'll remove the paper, they'll spray adhesive or contact cement on both surfaces, stick this stuff down, and then it's solid. You don't have to worry about any of that curvature or dishing that might happen. That just is a mess to clean up because you will need to replace this paper, as we talked about. It's not a terribly efficient use of material and your time, and shipping this stuff off or using a really nasty chemical or solvent to get in here and loosen this to clean up the surface. It just seems like it's fraught with problems. So, alright, so that was the Scary Sharp method. The other thing that we should talk about are sharpening stones. And for sharpening stones, there are kind of two options. This is a very small version of an oil stone, and it has two different abrasive qualities here. This darker gray is much more aggressive. This more tan or orange color is a little bit finer. Oil stones work, and people that use these things swear by them. A couple of problems with this for me. You'll need to use an oil as a lubricant in this sharpening stone. So again, we're abrading a chisel, we're chiseling the back or flattening the back or the bevel. If we have no lubricant inside the stone, there's all these open pores inside your stone when you're sharpening. If we don't have anything in there to float or release those little fragments of metal, if this stone were dry, for example, we would just be cramming pieces of steel into those pores, and then you very quickly lose the effectiveness of your sharpening stone. And so it's basically metal on the stone rubbing against metal, and it takes forever. It's no longer really abrading, it's basically just burnishing or polishing. And so it's not an ideal situation. The other thing that I don't love about the oil stones is that they take so much longer. It's not a very aggressive cut, and so sharpening the same stone as the next method I'm going to talk about, or sharpening the same chisel as the next method I'm going to talk about, it would take me 3 times as long potentially on an oil stone as it will with what I prefer, which we'll talk about shortly. The last thing about oil stones is that with this oil as your lubricant, this works and it's great. Oil has some high qualities or good qualities in that if this touches the metal of your steel that you're sharpening, chisels, hand planes, maybe you get it on one of your machines, maybe you're sharpening on a machine, which seems like a horrible idea, but maybe that's what you're doing. You don't have to worry about rust with using oil. The downside of this is, let's say I'm sharpening a chisel using an oil stone, and if I don't clean all of that oil, which now has fragments of the stone embedded into it, if I take that chisel or whatever cutting tool onto the workpiece that I'm trying to cut or shape or modify in some way, that oil could embed itself into the pores of that wood. So the fact that it's slower and it's a little bit messier, it seems like a no-brainer for me. I don't use oil stones anymore, and that's why I have this tiny little guy. So the method I do prefer are using a water stone. Water stones here work very similar to what we talked about with an oil stone, except you use water as the lubricant. The water stones need to be soaking or have 100% saturation of the water before you start abrading this. Some grits you don't need to do soaking overnight or giving it 15 to 20 minutes. Some of them you just spray water droplets on the surface and then it's ready to go. So I would definitely read the instructions that come with your stone, but the point is you need to have something to release those steel fragments that are going to otherwise be embedded into the water stone. One downside of this, some people leave these things in water, including myself, for when you are ready to sharpen, it's ready to go. Be very, very careful if you don't have an air-conditioned or a conditioned space with heat. If you're out in the garage and you're using your water stones, leaving this in a bath of water, it freezes in your garage. The water will freeze and it'll split the stone. It'll basically render this thing useless. So just be cautious about how you care for these things when between sharpenings. Okay, so the benefits of water stones are that they cut much faster. So comparison of the oil stone to the water stone, it's a much quicker operation to get into, more importantly get out of with a sharpening. For most woodworkers, there are two dreaded things that every woodworker fears. It's not invoicing, it's not billing, it's not going to the lumber yard. All of those things are very exciting, I think. But the two things that most woodworkers despise, one is sharpening, the other is sanding. And in a way, these operations function very similarly. I am using a sharpening stone to make finer and finer scratches into the steel. In a lot of ways, I am kind of sanding that steel or polishing it. But with a water stone, it makes a laborious chore much faster. I don't have to worry about the oil getting into my workpiece. I do have to be worried about where I store this and how long I leave the water in contact with my chisels or plane blades or marking knives or whatever it is you're sharpening. So anyway, I like water stones for that. The downside of water stones is that they dish much faster than an oil stone will, and you don't have to worry about with the scary sharp method because typically you're not going to abrade past that abrasive sheet. But with this, it starts to dish, and then you'll need to correct that because just like we talked about with the scary sharp method, this has got to be dead flat in order to get a nice flat surface on your chisel, your plane blades, whatever. So I like water stones. We'll talk about the methodology behind that and preparation of these stones here shortly.